By mid-August of 1918, the armistice that would end the Great War was just 3 months away, but that didn't mean that the war was over. As the armies of Europe neared exhaustion, the men of America's 28th Infantry Division were thrown into a nearly forgotten battle that fully represented the horrors of the war to end all wars. What the Entente powers called the Second Battle of the Marne was actually a diversion. German General Erich Ludendorff's real goal was a breakthrough in Flanders that could split the British and French armies and finally defeat the British Expeditionary Force, forcing the Entente to surrender. The initial assault, called Operation Friedensturm, or Peace Offensive, would include some 23 divisions, but the Entente powers had anticipated the attack and had not only had time to prepare their defenses, but planned a significant counterattack, time to quickly follow the German offensive and hit their lines as they were spread thin. That counteroffensive would include divisions of the armies of the French, British Empire, notably Canadians and Australians, Italians, and Americans. While the Supreme Allied Commander, French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, had announced plans to establish an independent U.S. Army on July 10th, at this point U.S. troops were still operating under foreign commands. Historians Stephen C. McGeorge and Mason W. Watson of the U.S. Army's Center of Military History noted in 2018, even though General John J. Pershing objected to American units serving as part of Allied armies, the crisis provoked by the German 1918 spring offensives had led him to release American divisions for service in French and British commands. It wasn't the Americans' first taste of combat. They had seen action in May at Cantigny, Belleau Wood, and Chateau-Thierry. They had generally acquitted themselves well. Historian John Keegan said of them, these fresh troops fought with a disregard for casualties scarcely seen on the Western Front since the beginning of the war. The Germans found little success in their offensive, which began on July 15th. McGeorge and Watson write that intelligence pieced together from various sources gave the Allies a remarkable, accurate, and detailed understanding of the scale, objectives, and even the precise timing of the next German offensive. The Americans of the 3rd Infantry Division's 38th Infantry Regiment held so stoutly along the Marne River that they were given the nickname, the Rock of the Marne. With the failure of the offensive, the counteroffensive could begin. It was well timed. McGeorge and Watson note the German forces in the Marne salient were disorganized, depleted, and exhausted after nearly 4 months of continuous fighting. The counteroffensive found success, but at high cost. The U.S. 1st and 2nd Divisions, spearheading the attack of the 20 Corps, took particularly heavy casualties. By August 4th, the counterattack had driven the Germans back to the Vesle River. It was there, in the twin towns of Fismes and Fismette, that the counteroffensive would run into a wall. McGeorge and Watson write, although the Germans retreated from their positions between the Irk River and the Vesle without putting up much of a fight, they had transformed Fismes and Fismette into veritable fortresses. One veteran of the U.S. 32nd Division later recalled that the Germans had spared no effort in making this city and surrounding country as impregnable as science could make it. Huge stores of ammunition and engines of destruction were located here, and preparations made to withstand the most formidable attack. The German lines held at the Vesle. When counterattack spent, the Second Battle of the Marne concluded on August 6th. The battle had been a costly one for the American Expeditionary Force. Of the roughly 270,000 Americans who fought in the Second Battle of the Marne, 39,672 had become casualties. Among the American units involved, assigned to the French 6th Army, commanded by General Jean Degout, was the 28th Division. Units of the 28th traced all the way back to voluntary local defense militias formed in colonial Pennsylvania and largely organized by Benjamin Franklin, starting on December 7th, 1747. The division served during the war with Spain and in El Paso to protect the U.S. border while the Army conducted the 1916 punitive expedition. The division was drafted into federal service for the Great War on August 5th, 1917. The division had defended the Marne in the initial German offensive on July 15th, near Chateau-Thierry. Their defense had been so stout that General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, had declared the men of the 28th men of iron, and named the 28th his Iron Division. One French officer wrote of the men of the 28th, with such admirable soldiers as yours and ours, the defeat of the Germans is certain in the near future. Brigadier General Dennis Nolan, commander of the division's 55th Infantry Brigade, said of the 28th, they struck me as the best soldiers I had ever seen. They were veterans, survivors who didn't seem to be oppressed by the death of other men. The division took heavy casualties in the hard fighting in the first days of the counterattack. After a brief rest period in the reserve, the 28th relieved the 32nd near Fiume on August 6th. By then, the Allied focus had shifted, with George and Watson Wright. Foch, who had been promoted to Marshal of France on August 5th, recognized that further large-scale efforts against the Velle would only bring diminishing returns. Instead of battering at the German defensive positions there, Foch placed his hopes in the long-awaited offensive by the British Fourth Army near Amiens, scheduled for August 8th. The front on the Velle was now nearly forgotten, but the battle was not over for the men of the 28th Infantry Division. Hervey Allen, a lieutenant with Company B of the 1st Battalion of the 111th Regiment of the 28th Division, described the town of Fiume when they relieved the men of the 32nd. Fiume itself was for the most part ours. Germans were thought to still be in some of the houses sniping or scattered along the railroad near the river. During the day, a more or less stealthy manhunt went on from house to house, with occasional brisk fights, while the enemy shelled the town constantly from the heights across the river, throwing shells down in Fiume, sometimes in a barrage and sometimes intermittently. There was scarcely any time when you could not hear one bursting somewhere, followed by the slide and crumbling sound of brick and plaster or the tinkle of glass. Having occupied the town for so long himself, Fritz was disgustingly familiar with it and knew all the best places to shell. He was struck by the eerie silence of the town, writing, "Imagine your own hometown without a single soul in it. Wrecked after a great storm and partially burned, and with all the evidences of the familiar activities of everyday life about, but that life and movement cut off suddenly, turned off like a light, and you will have a little idea of Fiume." But while Fiume was dangerous, it was not half so much as its sister, Fismette, which was north across a narrow bridge over the Velle. The 28th Infantry Division Association writes on the Facebook page of the Pennsylvania Military Museum, "The town of Fiume guarded a crossing over the Velle, with the small town of Fismette on the opposite bank. As the 112th Infantry occupied Fiume, it was clear that the town of Fismette across the river was filled with enemy snipers and machine guns who would torment their existence." But the men of the 28th could not stay in the relative safety of Fiume. General Disgust wanted a foothold across the Velle. Historian Edward G. Lengel noted in a 2011 post on the website HistoryNet that Major General Robert Lee Bullard, commander of the U.S. Third Corps, and Major General Charles H. Muir, commander of the 28th Division, argued that the bridgehead at Fismette was too vulnerable. Enemy-held hills overlooked it on all sides, and withdrawal under fire of the Velle would be next to impossible. Disgust, however, insisted, and the Americans, under his command, Lengel writes, had to swallow their objections. Lengel writes, on the night of August 6 to 7, troops of the 112th Infantry attacked the village, but German resistance was too strong, and they had to withdraw. They tried again the following morning, after American artillery laid down a heavy barrage, and after a savage street fight, they gained enough of a toehold to hang on. For the next 24 hours, attacks, counterattacks, and constant hand-to-hand fighting engulfed Fismette in an inferno of flame, smoke, and noise. The 28th Infantry Division Association writes, this attack into Fismette would be repeated for the next month. From August 7th until September 8th, the Keystone Division fought a brutal street fight, day after day. Between August 7th and 9th, the 112th had sustained nearly 400 casualties. The night of the 9th, Allen's company was ordered to cross into Fismette and relieve the men of the 112th. The orders, of course, he recalled, had been written by someone looking at a map and typed in a comfortable billet some 20 or 30 kilos in the rear. He described the bridge across the Velle. Big stones from the coping lay scattered about the top of the bridge itself, and in one place only there was a section about 2 feet wide on which to cross. The river below was a tangle of debris, a snarl of old wire. The mud banks were splashed and pitted with shell holes, where the mud geysers had spouted over everything when the shells hit. The men attempted to assault the hills outside the town, covered by German machine guns. Allen's captain was killed. The attack was repulsed. Conferring with the remaining officers, Allen volunteered to swim across the river to seek instruction from command. He wrote of the swim, "I had to put my mask on at the last, as the mustard gas was strong in the little hollow in which I lay. My hands were smarting. Some of the shells brought my heart into my mouth. Lying there waiting for them was intolerable. I was sure I was going to be blown to pieces." The river was very nearly in flood, and so there was no bank, the field gradually getting soggy and swampy till it sloped out into the water. There was a lot of submerged barbed wire that made going ahead very painful and slow. I had, of course, to throw away my mask as it got full of water. My pistol went also. It was too heavy to risk. As he got to the other side of the river, he saw it swept with machine gun fire, and he recalled, I lay there in the river for a minute and gave up. When you do that, something dies inside. But he saw a culvert that offered some cover and made it across. He reached the commander of the 3rd Battalion, Major Alan Donnelly, and appraised him of the situation across the river. The gravity of affairs, he wrote, was at once apparent. Donnelly ordered Allen to lead reinforcements across the river that night. The next day, Sergeant James Mestrovich of Company C of the 111th was pinned down with his company by German machine gun fire. His men were forced to retreat. Surveying the battlefield, he noticed that Captain James A. Williams, commander of A Company, who had fallen in the assault and was presumed to have died, was lying some 30 yards away from his position and was moving. The captain was still alive. Mestrovich was an ethnic Serb who had immigrated to the United States in 1911. Mestrovich told a Texas newspaper in 1916 that he had enlisted out of gratitude, as U.S. doctors had treated a typhus outbreak in his native Serbia in 1914. But in a 2025 biography of Mestrovich, author Zvojan Petrovich credits his enlistment to a hope that he might join the fight for freedom in Europe, in a war that had already embroiled his family in what is modern-day Montenegro. Under the relentless machine gun fire, Mestrovich called for his company to cover him, leapt up, and ran for the wounded captain. Petrovich writes that when Mestrovich got to Williams, the captain said, James, what in God's name are you doing here? Getting you home, sir, he replied. Crawling through heavy machine gun fire, an Army citation later read, he took the officer upon his back and crawled to a place of safety, where he administered first aid treatment. His exceptional heroism saved the officer's life. Allen recalled, that night we set to work immediately to try to get Captain Williams of A Company across the river before daylight. He had been struck by a machine gun bullet in the attack that morning. The bullet had traveled around his ribs and, lodging under the spine, had paralyzed him. They managed to carry Williams to a cave that was serving as an aid station. Wounded by machine gun fire later that day, Mestrovich had been reported killed in action, but the report was an error. Sergeant Mestrovich survived and was taken to a hospital. He was recovering and been promoted to lieutenant. His uncle received a letter. They operated twice on me, and in another month I think I will be just as good as I was, and ready for the front again. On the 11th, Lingo writes, Major Donnelly came with an order. The men of the 3rd Battalion were ordered to assemble and attack at dawn in an attempt to take the town and surrounding hills. Allen wrote it was a frightful order. Murder. All of us knew that. I tried to explain the situation to the major, thinking he did not know that he was flinging 3 companies against the German army. But I left off, seeing that he did know and was only carrying out what he had been ordered to do. After a few minutes, Lingo writes, a handful of doughboys, all that remained of the battalion, came staggering back down the hill, chased by German shells. 2 days later, the Germans attempted an all-out assault. The Germans attacked with their dreaded stormtroopers, armed with terrifying Flammenwerfer. Allen wrote, the men along the crest curled up like leaves to save themselves as the flame and smoke rolled clear over them. There was another flash between the houses. One of the men stood up, turning around outlined against the flame. Oh, my God, he cried. Oh, God. Against all odds, the men of the 111th held. The battle for Fismette dragged on. The 28th Infantry Division Association writes, Fismette was much more akin to modern urban warfare. Streets were barricaded into strongpoints, observation posts and machine gun nests put in the upper floors of buildings, and basements turned into small bunkers to protect from the brutal shelling. Images of Fismes and Fismette invoked the memory of shell-scarred upon urban street fighting of World War II, not the fight of the doughboys in 1918. By August 26th, the 28th had cleared the village of Germans, but they knew they couldn't hold it. Bullard and Muir ordered a withdrawal, but were countermanded by de Groot. Major Bullard reported to Pershing, I therefore decided and began to withdraw the garrison of Fismette, some 300 meters back across the Vel River into Fismes. But before this was finished, the French general commanding the 6th Army, to which I belong, arrived at my headquarters, and learning of my orders to withdraw from Fismette, himself in person directed me to continue to hold Fismette, and how to hold it. My orders were changed in his presence, and his orders were obeyed. The Germans made another assault the next day. The 28th Infantry Division Association writes, this resulted in hand-to-hand fighting, rendered difficult because of poor visibility at that hour of the day. Communications was cut off to the rear by enemy artillery. Hand grenades were the chief weapon in the attack, though in the left sector the use of liquid fire was reported. Bullard reported, yesterday morning the Germans made a strong attack upon Fismette from 2 directions, taking the village and killing or capturing almost all of our men. The men of the 112th were overwhelmed. The association writes of the 230 men in the town before the attack, 28 made their way back to U.S. lines, with the rest being killed or captured. Fismette was back in the hands of the Germans. Pershing was furious at the Gut. The 111th retook the town on September 4th. In a month's fighting, the town had changed hands 5 times.
In the end, that fragile bridgehead at Fismette that was the subject of so much fighting was never used in another offensive. Events elsewhere would force the Germans to withdraw from the area. The 100-day offensive had begun and would put an end to the war. Lieutenant Hervey Allen was wounded the night of the 13th by shrapnel. He was evacuated, spent the rest of the war in a field hospital. Lieutenant James Mestrovich recovered from his wounds, returned to his unit. He was killed by machine gun fire during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, just a week before the end of the war. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for saving Captain Williams' life. In a month of fighting, the men of the 28th Infantry Division suffered nearly 2,000 casualties around Fismes and Fismette. In addition to the Medal of Honor, there were 36 Distinguished Service Crosses awarded for actions during the battle. An estimated 90% of the town of Fismes was destroyed in the battle. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.